The year 2847 marked humanity's proudest moment. After 300 years of careful preparation, Earth had finally joined the Galactic Concordat. The celebration lasted for weeks across all human worlds. People danced in the streets of New York, London, Tokyo, and New Beijing. Children wore costumes designed to look like the different alien species. Everyone believed that humanity had reached its destiny among the stars. The Concordat was a union of 47 different species. They came in all shapes and sizes. Some looked almost human, while others were so strange that it hurt to look at them for too long. They had rules for everything: how to trade, how to communicate, how to settle disputes without war. The Concordat had brought peace to the galaxy for over 2,000 years. At the head of this great alliance sat the Velshara Empire. They were an ancient race of reptilian beings who stood 7 feet tall. Their scales ranged from deep green to blood red. Their eyes were cold and yellow like a snake's. The Velshara had been spacefaring for 5,000 years. They had never lost a war. Their empire stretched across 200 star systems. Ambassador Chen was humanity's voice in the Concordat. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She believed deeply in peace and understanding. She had spent her entire life studying alien cultures and learning their languages. To her, joining the Concordat meant that humanity would never again face the horrors of war. Chen gave speeches across human space about the benefits of membership. She talked about shared technology and cultural exchange. She described the medical advances that alien science could bring. She promised that human children would grow up in a universe where different species worked together in harmony. The people loved her for this vision, but not everyone in the Concordat welcomed humanity. In the grand halls of Velsharath, the Velshara homeworld, Supreme Overlord Kesethar listened to his advisors with growing concern. The reports were troubling. Human colonies were thriving. Human merchants were outcompeting traditional Velshara trading houses. Human diplomats were settling disputes that the Velshara had kept deliberately unresolved for profit. Kesthar was old even by Velshara standards. He had ruled for 60 years. His scales were dark red, almost black. When he spoke, even his own generals felt fear. He had built his power on the principle that the Velshara were superior to all other species. Now these newcomers, these mammals called humans, threatened that order. What bothered Kesthar most was humanity's reputation. The humans were famous throughout the Concordat for their forgiveness. They had nearly destroyed themselves in something called the Third World War. Nuclear weapons had devastated Earth. Billions had died. But instead of continuing to fight, the survivors had put down their weapons. They had built a united government. They had sworn never to wage war again. To Kesthar, this was not wisdom. It was weakness. A species that could forgive anything would never be a real threat. They would accept peace terms rather than fight. They would compromise rather than destroy their enemies. This made them the perfect target. General Thraknor commanded the Velshara war fleet. He was younger than Kesethar, but just as ruthless. His scales were bright red, marking him as a warrior from birth. He had won 3 major campaigns against species that resisted Velshara expansion. When Kesethar summoned him to the throne room, Thraknor knew what was coming. The orders were clear. The Velshara fleet would conduct military exercises near human space. This was perfectly legal under Concordat law, but the real purpose was to study human defenses and prepare for what would come next. Thraknor accepted his mission without hesitation. He despised the humans and their naive talk of peace. Humanity controlled 12 colony worlds at that time. Each one was a jewel in its own right. New Harmony had beautiful oceans and perfect weather. Hope's Landing was famous for its universities and research centers. Eden's Gate produced food enough to feed 3 star systems. These worlds were not heavily defended. After all, the Concordat guaranteed their safety. No member species would dare attack another. Ambassador Chen noticed the Velshara fleet movements but was not alarmed. She sent polite inquiries through official channels. The Velshara replied that they were conducting routine training. Chen accepted this explanation. She believed in the system. She believed in the law. She believed that no one would violate the sacred rules of the Concordat. The warning signs were there for those who knew how to read them. Velshara merchants began withdrawing from human markets. Velshara diplomats stopped attending meetings with human representatives. Velshara ships avoided human trade routes. But Chen and her team saw only isolated incidents, not a pattern. On Earth, life continued as normal. People went to work. Children went to school. Scientists made discoveries. Artists created beauty. Humanity was at peace with itself and with the universe. The dark days of the Third World War seemed like ancient history. No one seriously believed that humanity would ever need to fight again. Then came the message that changed everything. It appeared on every communication channel simultaneously. Kesthar's face filled screens across human space. His yellow eyes stared out with cold calculation. His message was short and direct. Humanity would immediately surrender control of 3 colony worlds to the Velshara Empire. This was for the good of the Concordat. This would ensure stability and proper leadership. Ambassador Chen was shocked. She immediately contacted the Concordat Council, demanding an emergency session. This was a clear violation of Concordat law. No member species could demand territory from another. The rules were absolute. Surely the Council would intervene. But the Council moved slowly. Some species suggested that perhaps the humans should consider the Velshara request. After all, the Velshara had much more experience in governing colonies. Maybe humanity was expanding too quickly. Maybe they needed guidance from their elders in the Concordat. Chen could not believe what she was hearing. These were supposed to be her allies. Back on Earth, Premier Zhao called an emergency meeting of the United Earth Assembly. He was a practical man who had led humanity through difficult times before. He knew that they had to refuse the Velshara demand. To surrender even one colony would show weakness. It would invite further demands. But he also knew that humanity was not prepared for conflict. The vote was unanimous. Humanity would not surrender its worlds. Ambassador Chen drafted a carefully worded response. It cited 17 different Concordat laws that the Velshara demand violated. It appealed to reason and justice. It proposed mediation by neutral species. Chen truly believed that once everyone saw the legal arguments, the matter would be resolved peacefully. She sent the response through official channels. Then she waited for a reply. Hours passed, then days. The Velshara remained silent. Their fleet continued to mass near human space. Chen sent follow-up messages. She requested meetings. She offered compromises on unrelated issues. She did everything she could think of to start a dialogue. Finally, after 5 days of silence, the Velshara sent a reply. It was not what Chen expected. There were no words, no legal arguments, no counter-proposals. Just an image. It showed the Velshara war fleet in perfect formation. Thousands of ships bristling with weapons. And behind them, visible in the distance, the blue marble of Hope's Landing, one of humanity's most populated colonies. Then the transmission cut to black. Chen stared at the blank screen, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes had shown her. It was not possible. The Concordat had laws. It had rules. Member species did not threaten each other with military force. That was the entire point of the alliance. But deep down, in a place she did not want to acknowledge, Chen knew the truth. The Velshara were not interested in law or reason. They had already made their decision. The fleet was not there to intimidate. It was there to attack. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. On Hope's Landing, people went about their normal lives. The warning had not been shared with the civilian population. There was no point in causing panic over what might be an empty threat. Parents took their children to school. Workers went to their jobs. The sun shone down on parks where young people played games and old people sat on benches. In orbit above the planet, the small human defense fleet went about its routine patrols. There were only 12 ships. They were designed for police work and rescue operations, not warfare. Their commanders had trained for pirates and accidents, not military invasion. When their sensors picked up the Velshara fleet approaching, they assumed it was still part of the training exercises. Captain Rivera commanded the defense station above Hope's Landing. She was the first to realize something was wrong. The Velshara ships were not maintaining the safe distance required during exercises. They were moving into attack formation. She opened communication channels trying to hail the fleet. There was no response. Rivera gave the order to raise shields and arm weapons. Her crew moved with well-practiced efficiency. But she knew the truth. Her 12 ships could not stop a fleet of thousands. She sent an emergency message to Earth. Then she said a quiet prayer and waited for the end. The Velshara opened fire without warning. The first human ship to die was the Destiny, a patrol vessel with a crew of 38. It was destroyed so quickly that there was not even time to send a distress signal. One moment it was there. The next it was expanding debris. Then the Velshara turned their weapons toward Hope's Landing itself. The people below had no idea what was about to happen. They looked up at the sky and saw beautiful lights like fireworks. They did not know they were watching the death of their world. The attack came without warning across all 12 human colonies at exactly the same moment. It was coordinated with military precision. The Velshara had planned every detail. They knew where every defense station was located. They knew where the civilian populations were concentrated. They knew where the hospitals and schools stood, and they struck at all of them simultaneously. Hope's landing died first. The orbital bombardment lasted only 10 minutes. Plasma weapons turned the atmosphere into fire. Kinetic missiles struck at near light speed, creating explosions that could be seen from space. The cities below simply ceased to exist. Buildings that had stood for 100 years vanished in an instant. Parks where children had played became craters. Hospitals full of patients were reduced to ash. On Eden's Gate, the attack was different but no less horrific. The Velshara used biological weapons that Earth had never imagined. A plague spread through the population within hours. People died in agony, their bodies failing them in terrible ways. The medical facilities were overwhelmed in the first 30 minutes. Doctors and nurses worked until they too fell sick. Within a day, the planet was silent. New Harmony suffered the longest. The Velshara wanted to send a message, so they took their time. The bombardment lasted 72 hours. They struck in waves, giving the people below hope between attacks. Survivors crawled from the rubble only to be hit again. Emergency shelters were targeted specifically. The Velshara made sure that anyone trying to help others would die with them. Captain Sarah Jenkins commanded a cargo ship that happened to be jumping out of the New Harmony system when the attack began. Her ship was carrying supplies, nothing military, but she saw the Velshara fleet arrive. She saw the first strikes hit the planet. She tried to go back to help somehow, but her crew stopped her. There was nothing they could do except escape and warn Earth. Jenkins recorded everything her sensors could pick up. The video footage showed things that no human should have to see. Schools exploding, hospitals burning, evacuation ships being shot down as they tried to escape. The Velshara were not just attacking military targets. They were deliberately killing civilians. They were trying to wipe out humanity completely. The distress calls flooded back to Earth, but they came too late to save anyone. By the time the first messages arrived, most of the colonies were already gone. The communication networks were filled with final words from people who knew they were about to die. Parents saying goodbye to their children on other worlds. Children crying for help that would never come. Teachers protecting their students until the very end. On Earth, Premier Zhao watched the messages come in. He sat in the emergency command center with his cabinet. They had to watch as humanity's colonies were destroyed one by one. The toll was beyond comprehension. Hope's Landing alone had held 2.1 billion people. Eden's Gate had 3.7 billion. New Harmony was home to 4.3 billion souls. In total, over 16 billion humans died in those 72 hours. But the Velshara were not finished. They sent landing forces to the surviving settlements. The purpose was not occupation. It was cruelty. They rounded up the survivors and separated them. The young and healthy were taken as slaves. They would be sold to the highest bidders across concordate space. The old and sick were simply executed. The Velshara showed no mercy because they did not believe humans deserved any. Children were torn from their parents' arms. Families that had survived the bombardment were destroyed anyway. The Velshara guards laughed as humans begged for mercy. They seemed to enjoy the suffering they were causing. To them, humans were not real people. They were animals to be used or destroyed as the Velshara saw fit. Ambassador Chen could not believe the reports at first. She kept thinking there must be a mistake. The Velshara would not do this. The Concordate would not allow it. There had to be an explanation that made sense. But the evidence kept coming in. Videos from ships that escaped, survivor testimonies, sensor data from remote monitoring stations. It was all real. Chen called another emergency session of the Concordate Council. This time she did not ask politely. She demanded action. She showed them the footage from the attacks. She read the death tolls. She described the slave markets where human children were being sold. Surely now the Concordate would act. Surely now they would condemn the Velshara and demand justice. But the council did nothing. Some species expressed regret at the loss of life. Others remained silent. A few even suggested that humanity must have provoked the attack somehow. Perhaps the humans had been too aggressive in their expansion. Perhaps they had threatened Velshara interests. Perhaps this tragedy could have been avoided if the humans had just accepted the original demand. Chen realized the truth in that moment. The Concordat was not a union of equals. It was a system designed to protect the strong and control the weak. The Velshara could do whatever they wanted because they had the power. The law meant nothing without someone willing to enforce it, and no one would enforce it against the Velshara. Supreme Overlord Kesthar broadcast a message to Earth. It played on every screen in human space. His yellow eyes showed no emotion as he spoke. The message was simple. Humanity would immediately become a vassal state of the Velshara Empire. They would pay reparations for the cost of the military operation. They would accept Velshara governors on all remaining human worlds. If they refused, Earth itself would share the fate of the colonies. But then Kesthar said something that revealed his true thinking. He told humanity not to worry. He understood that humans were a forgiving species. He knew that given time, humanity would accept what had happened. They would forgive the Velshara for the colonies, just as they had forgiven each other after their own wars. It was simply human nature to forget and move on. This was Kesathar's great mistake. He believed his own propaganda. He thought that because humans preached forgiveness, they were incapable of hatred. He thought that because humans had chosen peace, they had forgotten how to make war. He thought that humanity would accept any terms rather than fight. He was wrong. The United Earth Assembly met to vote on the Velshara terms. Every representative from every nation was present. The mood was somber. Many had lost family members in the colonies. Some had lost entire families. They had all seen the videos. They had all read the reports. They knew exactly what the Velshara had done. Premier Zhao stood before the assembly. He was an old man now, and he looked even older after the past few days. He spoke slowly and carefully. He explained the Velshara terms. He outlined what acceptance would mean. Humanity would survive, but they would never be free again. Their children would grow up as subjects of an empire that had murdered billions of humans. Before the vote could be called, Admiral Sarah Okonkwo requested permission to speak. She was the head of Earth's defense forces, such as they were. She was a tall woman with dark skin and graying hair. She had served in the military for 40 years, most of that time during the long peace. She had never expected to fight a real war, but she was about to change everything. Okonkwo walked to the front of the chamber. She carried a data tablet. On it were classified files that most of the representatives had never seen. She began to speak about Earth's history, about the Third World War, about the weapons that had nearly destroyed the planet, about the choice humanity had made to put those weapons aside. But putting weapons aside was not the same as destroying them. Deep in the classified military archives hidden from public knowledge was something called Project Thanatos. It was humanity's insurance policy. The weapons from the old wars had not been destroyed. They had been stored, studied, improved. Because the people who created Project Thanatos understood an important truth. The galaxy might not be as peaceful as humanity hoped. Okonkwo showed them what was hidden in the Sol system. Weapons platforms disguised as asteroids, shipyards built into the moons of Jupiter, production facilities that could turn out 1,000 warships in a month, railguns that could fire projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed, antimatter bombs that made nuclear weapons look like toys, an entire military infrastructure that humanity had built in secret over 3 centuries. The assembly sat in shocked silence. They had believed in peace. They had trusted in the Concordat. They had thought humanity's weapons were a thing of the past. But their ancestors had been wiser. They had prepared for the day when forgiveness would not be enough. That day had arrived. Okonkwo explained what activation of Project Thanatos would mean. It would mean war. Not a small war or a limited war, but total war. Humanity would not stop until the Velshara Empire was destroyed. It would cost lives. It would cost resources. It might even cost Earth itself if the Velshara struck before human forces were ready. But it was the only way to answer what had been done to the colonies. Premier Zhao called for the vote. The question was simple. Would humanity accept the Velshara terms and become a vassal state? Or would humanity activate Project Thanatos and choose war? The representatives did not hesitate. The vote was unanimous. Every single member voted for war. They voted for it because they remembered the videos from the colonies. They voted for it because 16 billion people deserved justice. They voted for it because the Velshara had mistaken mercy for weakness. Admiral Okonkwo returned to her command center. She sent out the activation codes for Project Thanatos. Across the Sol system, hidden facilities powered up. Weapon platforms came online. Shipyards began production runs. Recruitment centers opened on every continent of Earth. Veterans who had retired decades ago put their uniforms back on. Young people who had never thought about military service lined up to volunteer. Earth sent a message to the Velshara Empire. It was broadcast on all channels so that every species in the Concordat would hear it. The message was short. Humanity rejected the terms. Humanity withdrew from the Concordat effective immediately. And humanity declared war on the Velshara Empire. The war would end only when the Velshara no longer existed as a power in the galaxy. But the message included something else. A warning to all the other Concordat species. Any species that aided the Velshara would be considered an enemy of humanity. Any species that harbored Velshara refugees would be considered complicit in war crimes. Any species that stood in humanity's way would be removed. This was not a threat. It was a promise. The galaxy had seen humanity as weak. They had seen forgiveness and thought it meant humans could not hate. They had seen peace and thought it meant humans could not fight. They had seen mercy and thought it meant humans would accept any cruelty rather than strike back. Now they would learn the truth. Humanity had chosen peace because peace was better. But when peace was taken away, humanity remembered how to make war. And they were very, very good at it. The transformation of human space happened faster than anyone thought possible. Within hours of the declaration of war, every defensive platform in the Sol system came online. Satellites that had pretended to study asteroids revealed themselves as weapon stations. Mining facilities on distant moons opened to show vast military production lines. The infrastructure that humanity had hidden for 300 years was finally revealed. Admiral Okonkwo stood in the command center watching the displays. Each screen showed another system activating. Jupiter's moons were producing fighter craft. Saturn's rings held railgun platforms. Even tiny Pluto had weapons that could crack a planet. The people who had designed Project Thanatos had thought of everything. They had prepared for the day when humanity might need to fight for its survival. The human fleet began to take shape. Ship designs that had existed only in classified databases were now being built at incredible speed. The shipyards worked around the clock. Automated systems assembled hulls while human workers installed the weapons and engines. Ships rolled off the production lines every few hours. Each one was faster and deadlier than anything the Concordat had ever seen. The recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young and old, men and women, people from every nation wanted to serve. They had all seen what the Velshara had done. Many had lost family or friends in the colonies. They wanted revenge, but more than that, they wanted justice. They wanted to make sure that what happened to the 12 colonies could never happen again. Captain Marcus Chen was one of the first to volunteer. He was 50 years old and had retired from the Defense Forces 10 years earlier. He had spent his retirement teaching history at a university, but his sister had lived on Hope's Landing with her family, 3 children, all under the age of 10. They were all gone now. Chen put his uniform back on and reported for duty. He was not alone. Thousands of veterans returned to service. The training was intense, but efficient. Humanity had forgotten much about war, but the knowledge was still there in the archives. Combat tactics, strategic planning, psychological operations, everything that had made humans such effective warriors during their violent past was now being relearned. But this time, it would be used against an external enemy, not against other humans. Human scientists worked on weapons that the galaxy had never imagined. Relativistic kill missiles that could strike from light years away. Quantum destabilizers that could make enemy ships simply stop existing. Swarm AI combat drones that could learn and adapt faster than any living pilot. Nanite clouds that could disassemble entire space stations molecule by molecule. Every resource of human innovation was turned toward the goal of destruction. But the Velshara were not worried. Supreme Overlord Kesisthar received reports about human military activity with amusement. So the humans were building ships. So what? The Velshara fleet numbered in the tens of thousands. They had been fighting wars for 5,000 years. The humans had been at peace for 300. This would be no contest. The humans were making a show of defiance before they inevitably surrendered. Kesathar's generals agreed. They studied the human ship designs and dismissed them. Too fast, not enough armor. Too many weapons, not enough defense. The humans were building attack craft, not proper warships. They would be destroyed in the first engagement. General Thraknor, who had led the attack on the colonies, requested permission to finish the job. He wanted to strike Earth directly and end this foolishness. But Kesathar had a different idea. He wanted to teach humanity a lesson about power. He wanted to show them that resistance was futile. So he ordered his forces to attack human shipping and outlying settlements, small targets that could be destroyed easily. Each victory would remind the humans that they could not win. Eventually they would see reason and surrender. The Velshara strike force headed for the mining colony at Kresh Prime. It was a small Velshara settlement in neutral space. The attack would serve multiple purposes. It would give the warriors more practice, it would secure valuable resources, and it would show the other concordate species what happened to those who sided with humanity. The fleet arrived expecting an easy victory. Instead, they found a human stealth fleet waiting for them. The ships had been hiding in the asteroid field, around the system. The Velshara sensors never detected them until it was too late. The human ships moved with incredible speed. They struck from multiple directions at once. Their weapons were devastatingly effective. Velshara shields that had withstood centuries of warfare simply failed under the assault. Captain Chen commanded one of the human destroyers. His ship, the Revenge, was fast and deadly. He targeted the Velshara flagship first. The enemy commander never had time to call for help. The Revenge's railgun fired a projectile at 1/10 of light speed. It went through the Velshara shields like they were not there. The flagship broke in half and exploded. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When the fighting was over, every Velshara ship was destroyed. Not damaged, not disabled. Destroyed. The humans showed no mercy because none had been shown to them. But they did not stop there. They turned their weapons on Kresh Prime itself. The colony had supported the attack on human worlds. Its resources had supplied the Velshara fleet. Now it would pay the price. The bombardment was precise and thorough. Military installations went first, then industrial facilities, then government buildings. The human fleet gave the civilian population time to evacuate, but not much time. Those who stayed did so at their own risk. In the end, Kresh Prime was uninhabitable. The atmosphere was burned away. The crust was cracked open. The once thriving colony was reduced to a dead rock orbiting its star. Before leaving the system, Admiral Okonkwo sent a message to the Velshara Empire. It was broadcast on all frequencies so that everyone would hear it. The message was simple and direct. This was mercy. This was humanity showing restraint. The Velshara had 72 hours. They could use that time to evacuate their civilians from the war zone. After that, humanity would show them what real destruction looked like. The message ended with a warning to the rest of the galaxy. Any species that aided the Velshara would be considered an enemy. Any species that harbored them would be targeted. Humanity would not stop until the Velshara Empire was completely destroyed. This was not negotiable. This was not subject to debate. This was simply going to happen. The reaction across the Concordate was shock. Many species had believed the Velshara propaganda about human weakness. They had thought the humans would surrender. After a few defeats, now they realized the truth. The humans were not weak. They had simply chosen not to show their strength. That choice had been taken away from them. What remained was something the galaxy had not seen in millennia. A species truly committed to total war. Supreme Overlord Kesathar received the report about Kresh Prime with disbelief. An entire fleet destroyed. A colony wiped out. It was not possible. The humans must have gotten lucky. Or perhaps they had help from some other species. He ordered more ships to the front. He would crush this human rebellion with overwhelming force. Then he would make an example of Earth that the galaxy would never forget. But the humans were not waiting for the Velshara to come to them. They were taking the war to the enemy. Human strike teams hit Velshara facilities across the galaxy. They used tactics that the Velshara had never encountered: hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, sabotage. The humans fought like guerrillas, not like a conventional military force. They struck where they were not expected and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. Dr. Lisa Park led one of these teams. She was a scientist who had worked on propulsion systems. Her husband had died on New Harmony. Now she used her knowledge to destroy Velshara ships from the inside. Her team would board disabled vessels and plant charges in the engine cores. The resulting explosions would destroy not just one ship, but damage everything around it. It was dangerous work, but Park never hesitated. The Velshara tried to adapt to human tactics, but they could not. Their military doctrine was based on overwhelming force and direct confrontation. They had rules about how warfare should be conducted. The humans ignored all those rules. They fought to win, not to follow some ancient code of honor. They used every advantage they could find. They exploited every weakness in Velshara defenses. Other concordate species watched the war with growing concern. Some felt sympathy for humanity. Others feared what would happen if the humans won. A few species quietly began supplying intelligence to the human forces. Locations of Velshara bases, weak points in their defense networks, safe routes through Velshara space. They did not do this out of love for humanity. They did it because they realized the Velshara had grown too powerful. Someone needed to humble them. The Velshara Empire began to crack. Species that had been conquered centuries ago saw their chance for freedom. They rose up in rebellion, thinking the humans would support them, and the humans did. They sent weapons and advisors. They shared military technology. They taught the rebels how to fight effectively. Soon the Velshara were fighting on a dozen fronts simultaneously. Supreme Overlord Kesthar finally understood his mistake. The humans were not like other species. They did not fight for territory or resources. They fought for revenge. They fought with the intensity of a species that had nothing left to lose. Every human in the military had lost someone in the colonies. Every ship was crewed by people who wanted to see the Velshara pay for their crimes. In a desperate move, Kesthar sent emissaries to Earth. They carried messages of peace. The Velshara would pay reparations. They would return all the slaves they had taken. They would put the war criminals on trial. They would accept any terms that humanity demanded. All they asked was for the war to stop. They wanted to negotiate a settlement. Premier Zhao received the emissaries personally. He listened to their offer in silence. When they finished, he gave them a very simple answer. No. There would be no negotiation. There would be no peace. There would be no mercy. The Velshara had been offered peace once. They had chosen violence instead. Now they would learn what violence really meant. The human fleet continued to advance. System after system fell to them. The Velshara retreated, trying to regroup, trying to find some way to stop the human advance. But there was no stopping it. The humans were relentless. They fought with a determination that the galaxy had never seen. They would not rest until the Velshara Empire was nothing but a memory. Finally, the human fleet reached Velsharath itself, the homeworld of the Empire, the seat of Velshara power for 5,000 years. It was the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy. Kesthar had pulled back his forces to make one last stand. He believed that even the humans could not crack the defenses of Velsharath. He was wrong. Admiral Okonkwo sent one final message to the Velshara homeworld. She gave the civilian population time to evacuate. Neutral ships arrived to take refugees to safety. The humans would not target civilians if they could avoid it. But Kesthar and his inner circle refused to leave. They believed their planet was impregnable. They thought they could still win. Admiral Okonkwo looked at the display, showing Velsharath and its sun. Then she gave the order that would end the Velshara Empire forever. Prometheus Protocol was humanity's most terrible weapon. The science behind it was elegant in its simplicity. A star was just a massive fusion reactor held in balance by gravity. If that balance was disrupted in exactly the right way, the star would release centuries of energy in a single burst. It would create a controlled supernova. The planet Velsharath orbited such a star. The human fleet moved into position around the Velshara sun. Special ships carried the equipment needed for Prometheus Protocol. They were designed for one purpose and one purpose only. The crews knew they might not survive the operation. The energy release would be massive. Even with all their shielding, escape was not guaranteed. But not one crew member asked to be reassigned. They all wanted to be part of ending the Velshara Empire. Admiral Okonkwo broadcast her final warning to Velshareth. She explained exactly what was about to happen. The star would go supernova in a controlled burst. The shockwave would reach the planet in approximately 72 hours. That was how long the Velshara had bombarded New Harmony. It seemed fitting. Any remaining civilians could still evacuate. The human fleet would not interfere with rescue ships. But after 72 hours, everything in this system would die. On Velsharath, panic swept through the population. Millions tried to flee the planet. But Supreme Overlord Kesithar ordered his military to prevent the evacuation. He believed the humans were bluffing. No species would destroy an entire star system. The cost was too high. The collateral damage would be unthinkable. Surely the humans would pull back at the last moment. They had to be civilized creatures who valued life. Kesithar was wrong. The humans were civilized. But they had learned a hard lesson. Civilization was a choice, not a weakness. They had offered civilization to the Velshara. They had offered peace and cooperation. The Velshara had answered with genocide. Now humanity would answer in the only language the Velshara understood. Complete and utter destruction. The Prometheus devices activated. They fired focused beams of exotic matter into the star's core. The effect was not immediate. For the first day, nothing seemed to happen. Then sensors began to pick up changes. The star's output was increasing. Its temperature was rising. The fusion reaction at its heart was becoming unstable. The process could not be stopped now. Even if the humans pulled back, the star would continue to destabilize. Some concordant species sent their own ships to help with the evacuation. They acted against Velshara orders. They saved millions of civilians who would otherwise have died with their world. But billions remained on the surface. Kesithar had ordered all spaceports closed. He executed anyone who tried to flee. He would rather see his entire species die than admit he had been wrong about the humans. The human fleet withdrew to a safe distance. They watched as the star continued to destabilize. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Retribution. She felt no joy in what was about to happen. This was not celebration. This was necessary horror. The Velshara had to be stopped. Not just defeated, but eliminated as a threat. Otherwise, they would rebuild and do it all again in a few generations. On the third day, the star exploded. The burst was visible across half the galaxy. A wave of energy and radiation spread out at the speed of light. Velsharath was vaporized instantly. The cities that had stood for 5,000 years ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. The great towers and monuments were reduced to their component atoms. The planet itself broke apart and was consumed by the fire. Supreme Overlord Kesithar died with his world. His last moments were spent watching the wall of fire approach through his palace windows. He finally understood his mistake. The humans were not weak. They were not forgiving. They were simply patient. They had given the Velshara every chance to choose peace. When peace was rejected, they had shown the galaxy what humans were capable of when pushed too far. The shockwave continued outward. It would take days to reach neighboring systems, but the human fleet had warned them all. Evacuation orders had been sent weeks in advance. Most species had taken the threat seriously and moved their populations to safety. A few had ignored the warnings. They paid the price. Entire colonies vanished in the fire. But the humans had given them a choice. That was more mercy than the Velshara had shown to anyone. The Velshara Empire collapsed overnight. Without their homeworld, without their supreme overlord, the remaining Velshara forces had no leadership. Some tried to fight on, but they were hunted down by human fleets. Others surrendered. A few fled to the edges of known space, hoping to hide until the humans forgot about them. But the humans never forgot. War crimes tribunals were established. Every Velshara officer who had participated in the colony massacres was tracked down and brought to justice. The Concordat was in shock. Many species had believed the humans incapable of such destruction. They had thought human talk of peace meant humans could not wage war. Now they understood. Humans chose peace because they knew what war cost. They had nearly destroyed themselves once. They knew exactly how to destroy others if necessary. That knowledge made their choice of peace more meaningful, not less. Species that had stood by during the colony massacres now approached Earth with apologies. They claimed they had not understood what was happening. They said they had believed Velshara propaganda. They offered reparations and support. Some of them were sincere. Many were simply afraid. They had seen what happened to the Velshara. They did not want humanity to turn its weapons on them next. But some species had helped humanity during the war. They had supplied intelligence. They had sheltered human refugees. They had spoken out against the Velshara when it was dangerous. To do so, these species were welcomed as true allies. Humanity had long memories for both cruelty and kindness. Those who had shown kindness would be rewarded. Those who had shown cruelty would be watched carefully. The war crimes trials lasted for years. Thousands of Velshara officers and officials were prosecuted. The evidence was overwhelming. Videos from the colony attacks, testimony from survivors, records from slave markets. The Velshara defendants tried to claim they were just following orders. The tribunals rejected this defense. Everyone was responsible for their own actions. Everyone would face consequences. General Thraknor, who had led the initial attack on the colonies, was captured trying to flee to another galaxy. He was brought back to Earth for trial. The courtroom was packed with survivors and families of victims. Thraknor showed no remorse. He claimed he had only been doing his duty as a soldier. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. He would spend the rest of his days thinking about what he had done. The freed slaves began returning home. Human ships transported them from across the galaxy. Many had been children when they were taken. Now they were adults who barely remembered Earth. The reunion programs helped them adjust to freedom. It was difficult for everyone. The returned slaves had trauma that would never fully heal. But they were alive. They were home. That was something. Humanity began the slow process of rebuilding the 12 colonies. The work would take decades. Some of the worlds were completely uninhabitable. They would need to be terraformed from scratch. Others could be restored more quickly. Each colony built a memorial to those who had died, simple monuments that listed every name, 16 billion names carved in stone, so that no one would ever forget. Admiral Okonkwo retired after the war. She was hailed as a hero, but she did not feel like one. She had done what was necessary, but the cost haunted her. She had ordered the death of a star system. Billions had died because of her commands. She understood why it had to be done, but understanding did not make it easier to live with. She spent her remaining years working with the returned slaves, trying to help them heal. Premier Zhao addressed the United Earth Assembly one final time before his own retirement. He spoke about the cost of peace. Peace was not free, it had to be defended. Sometimes it had to be fought for. The galaxy had learned that humanity preferred peace. But the galaxy had also learned that humanity would not accept peace at any price. There were things worth fighting for. There were evils that had to be opposed. The Concordat reformed under a new charter. This time humanity was one of the founding members. The rules were stricter. The enforcement was real. No species would be allowed to commit genocide ever again. No species would be permitted to enslave others. No species would escape justice for war crimes. The Concordat had failed humanity once. It would not fail again. But the new Concordat was built on a foundation of human military power. The galaxy now knew what humanity could do. They knew about Project Thanatos. They knew about Prometheus Protocol. They knew that humanity had weapons that could destroy entire star systems. This knowledge changed everything. Species that might have considered aggression thought twice. Species that might have oppressed others reconsidered their policies. Some called it Pax Humana, peace through human strength. It was not the peace that Ambassador Chen had dreamed of. It was not a peace based on mutual understanding and respect. It was a peace based on fear. Fear of what humanity would do to anyone who threatened that peace. It was not ideal, but it was real, and it worked. Other species began to understand what made humanity different. Humans did not seek war. They did not glorify violence. They remembered the cost of conflict too well. But when forced to fight, they fought with total commitment. They did not fight limited wars or symbolic conflicts. They fought to win absolutely. They fought until their enemies could never threaten them again. The surviving Velshara were scattered across the galaxy. Most tried to integrate into other societies. They changed their names. They hid their past. They taught their children to never speak of the old empire. But they never forgot what had happened, how their species had ruled the galaxy for 5,000 years, how they had believed themselves invincible, how humanity had proven them wrong in the most terrible way possible. Young Velshara grew up hearing whispered stories about the old days. They asked their elders why their species no longer had an empire, why they lived as refugees and outcasts. The elders would tell them about humanity, about the mistake their ancestors had made, about the price they paid for underestimating a species that valued peace. The lesson was clear. Never mistake mercy for weakness. Never confuse forgiveness with inability to seek justice. One young Velshara named Kess, named after the last supreme overlord, asked her teacher a question. Would the humans ever forgive what the Velshara had done? The teacher thought carefully before answering. Perhaps, she said. In time, humans have shown they can forgive even terrible crimes, but they will never forget. They will always remember the 16 billion who died. They will always remember the children who were enslaved. They will always remember what happened when someone mistook their love of peace for inability to wage war. The galaxy settled into its new order. Wars still happened, but they were smaller, more carefully managed, because everyone knew that if things went too far, humanity would intervene. And humanity's intervention meant devastation on a scale that the galaxy had only seen once before. When the Velshara Empire learned that some languages could only be spoken through destruction, and humanity was fluent in that language, they simply preferred not to speak it unless absolutely necessary. 50 years after the war, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. The old Concordat was gone. In its place stood a new alliance built on different principles. Member species had real rights that were protected by law. Aggression between members was met with immediate and overwhelming response. War crimes were prosecuted without exception, and behind it all stood humanity, the reluctant guardians of galactic peace. Earth had not wanted this role. After the war, humanity tried to return to its peaceful ways. They reduced their military. They focused on rebuilding. They wanted to be just another member species. But the other species would not let them. Every dispute, every conflict, every threat to peace resulted in calls for human intervention. The galaxy had learned to depend on human strength. Ambassador Maria Santos represented humanity in the new Concordat Council. She was the granddaughter of a woman who had died on Hope's Landing. She had grown up hearing stories about the colonies, about the war, about the terrible price humanity had paid. Now she worked to make sure that price had not been paid in vain. She worked to build a galaxy where such horrors could never happen again. The 12 colonies had been rebuilt. New cities stood where old ones had been destroyed. New families made homes on worlds that had been graveyards. But the memorials remained. Every colony had a wall of names, where the dead were remembered. School children visited these walls on field trips. They learned about what had happened. They learned why it must never happen again. New Harmony was the most changed. The planet had been completely sterilized during the war. Bringing it back to life took decades of work. Atmosphere processors, genetic seeding, careful ecosystem management. Now it was beautiful again. Oceans sparkled under a clean sky. Forests grew where radiation had once made the ground poisonous. But anyone who looked closely could still see the scars. Craters filled with water. Valleys where cities had stood. The land itself remembered. The central memorial on New Harmony was the largest in human space. It listed all 4.3 billion names of those who died there. The names were carved into black stone, in letters so small they could barely be read. It took hours to walk past them all. At the center stood a simple monument with words in every human language and many alien ones. The message was clear. This was the price of mistaking kindness for weakness. This was what happened when mercy was met with cruelty. Young Lieutenant James Park visited the memorial often. He was the son of Dr. Lisa Park, who had led sabotage missions during the war. His mother rarely spoke about those days, but sometimes, late at night, she would tell him stories. About the things she had done, about the people she had killed, about why it had been necessary. She wanted him to understand that peace was precious, that it had to be defended, that sometimes good people had to do terrible things to stop evil. Park served in the new Human Defense Forces. The military was smaller than during the war, but far more advanced. Human innovation had not stopped after the Velshara were defeated. If anything, it had accelerated. Humanity had learned that being the strongest was the only way to ensure peace. Other species might claim to want peace, but they would only maintain it if someone could enforce it. The defense forces trained constantly. They ran simulations of every possible conflict. They studied other species' tactics and weapons. They developed countermeasures to every threat, but they also learned restraint, how to use minimal force to achieve objectives, how to avoid civilian casualties, how to end conflicts quickly without causing unnecessary suffering. The goal was not to be the most destructive force in the galaxy. It was to be the most effective peacekeepers. Other species began sending their military officers to train with humanity. They wanted to learn human tactics and strategies. More importantly, they wanted to learn human discipline, how to fight only when necessary, how to show mercy when possible, how to balance strength with wisdom. The human military academies became the most prestigious in the galaxy. Graduation from a human academy was a mark of excellence recognized everywhere. But humanity's greatest influence was not military. It was cultural. Human art, music, and literature spread across the galaxy. Other species were fascinated by human stories about redemption and second chances, about choosing peace over violence, about the strength required to forgive. These ideas were foreign to many galactic cultures, but they resonated deeply. Species that had glorified war for millennia began to question their values. The Velshara, who remained, were the most changed. They no longer called themselves an empire. They had no homeworld. They existed as scattered communities across dozens of worlds. Most tried to integrate into local societies. They learned new languages. They adopted new customs. They worked hard to prove they were not like their ancestors. But the shadow of their past followed them everywhere. Young Kess, now an adult, worked as a mediator in disputes between species. She specialized in reconciliation and peace-building. It was her way of atoning for what her species had done. She could never bring back the dead. She could never undo the suffering. But she could work to prevent future conflicts. She could help species find peaceful solutions to their problems. It was difficult work, made harder by her own heritage. Many humans would not work with her at first, but slowly she earned their trust. Kess met Lieutenant Park at a conference on conflict resolution. He was teaching a seminar on military de-escalation. She was presenting research on historical peace agreements. They recognized each other's names immediately. His mother had fought in the war that destroyed her people's empire. They should have been enemies. Instead, they became friends. It was strange and difficult, but also hopeful. If they could move past their histories, perhaps the galaxy could too. They talked late into the night about forgiveness and justice. Park explained that humanity had not forgiven the Velshara for what was done. How could they? 16 billion dead could not be forgiven. But humanity had chosen to move forward, to build something better rather than dwell on hatred. That was different from forgiveness. It was acceptance that the past could not be changed, only learned from. Kes shared her own struggles. Growing up, Velshara meant growing up with shame. Every history lesson included the crimes her ancestors committed. Every interaction with other species included the unspoken knowledge of what the Velshara had done. She could never escape it. But she could choose how to respond. She could work to be different, to prove that Velshara were capable of change, that they could learn from their terrible mistakes. On Earth, the war generation was dying out. Admiral Okonkwo passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 103 years old. Her funeral was attended by thousands, veterans who had served under her, freed slaves she had helped, even some Velshara who credited her with showing mercy when she could have shown only destruction. She was buried with full military honors. Her tombstone was simple. It said only her name, her rank, and the dates she lived, nothing about the war. She would have wanted it that way. Premier Zhao had died years earlier. His legacy was the new Concordat, the system of laws and enforcement that prevented another genocide. Before he died, he gave one final interview. The reporter asked if he thought the war had been worth it. Zhao was silent for a long time. Then he said that the question was wrong. The war was not worth anything. War never was. But stopping the Velshara had been necessary. Sometimes terrible things had to be done to prevent worse things. That was the burden of leadership. The younger generation of humans had a different perspective. They had not lived through the war. They knew it only from history classes and memorial visits. To them, the Velshara were not monsters. They were just another species that had made terrible mistakes. This attitude sometimes frustrated the older generation, but it also gave hope. Perhaps the galaxy could truly move forward if the young were not trapped by the hatreds of their parents. But the young humans also learned important lessons from their elders. They learned that peace was not guaranteed, that evil existed in the universe, that sometimes good intentions were not enough. They learned to be strong without being cruel, to be merciful without being weak, to forgive when possible, but to never forget the lessons of history. These were hard lessons, but necessary ones. The galaxy celebrated the 50th anniversary of the war's end. It was a somber celebration. Memorials held ceremonies. Survivors told their stories. Politicians gave speeches about peace and justice, but the message was always the same. This must never happen again. The galaxy had paid too high a price. Too many had died. Too much had been lost. The only way to honor the dead was to ensure that future generations never faced such horror. Ambassador Santos gave the keynote address at the main ceremony. She spoke about her grandmother and the billions like her. People who had done nothing wrong. People who had simply been trying to live their lives. People who had believed in peace and paid for that belief with their lives. She said that humanity had learned two great lessons. First, that peace must be defended. Second, that strength without wisdom was tyranny. She reminded the audience that humanity had not wanted to be the galaxy's guardians. They had not sought power or influence. They had simply responded to an attack on their people. But having taken on that role, they would not abandon it. Humanity would continue to protect the peace, not because they enjoyed it, not because they sought glory, but because they remembered what happened when no one was willing to stand up to evil. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence. Across the galaxy, billions of beings stopped what they were doing. They thought about the war, about those who died, about the survivors who still carried scars, about the lessons that had been learned at such terrible cost. The silence lasted exactly 72 hours, the same amount of time the Velshara had bombarded New Harmony, so that no one would ever forget. After the silence ended, life returned to normal. People went back to work. Children went back to school. The galaxy continued turning. But something had changed. The anniversary had reminded everyone of what could be lost, of how quickly peace could turn to war, of how important it was to maintain the systems that protected everyone. The Concordat emerged from the anniversary stronger than before. Lieutenant Park and Kess continued their work together. They co-authored papers on conflict resolution. They gave lectures at universities across the galaxy. They showed that even species with the darkest shared history could work together for peace. Their friendship became a symbol of hope. If a human and a Velshara could collaborate, if they could build trust despite everything, then perhaps the galaxy really could move forward. But they never pretended the past did not matter. They never said that forgiveness made everything better. Instead, they taught that acknowledgement was the first step toward healing. The Velshara had to acknowledge what their empire had done. Humanity had to acknowledge that the current generation of Velshara were not responsible for their ancestors' crimes. Both species had to acknowledge that the past shaped them, but did not have to define them. 100 years after the war, historians would look back and identify it as the turning point in galactic civilization. Before the war, power determined right. After the war, justice became the foundation of order. The change was not immediate or complete. There were still conflicts. There was still suffering. But the direction had changed. The galaxy was slowly becoming a place where peace was real, not just an illusion maintained by the powerful. Humanity never stopped being cautious. They maintained their military. They kept their weapons ready. They trained their forces constantly. Because they understood something that many other species did not. Peace was not natural. It was not the default state of the universe. Peace had to be built and defended every single day. It required constant vigilance. It required the will to act when necessary. Most importantly, it required the wisdom to know when action was truly needed. The memorial on New Harmony became a pilgrimage site. Beings from across the galaxy came to see it, to read the names, to understand the cost of war, to remember that the galaxy had once stood by while billions died, to promise themselves they would never let it happen again. The memorial became more than just a monument to the dead. It became a symbol of the galaxy's commitment to peace. A young Velshara child visited the memorial with her class. She was too young to remember the war. She had been born long after the Velshara Empire fell. But she knew her history. She knew what her ancestors had done. She stood before the wall of names and cried, not from guilt. She had done nothing wrong, but from sorrow for all the lives that had been lost, from determination to be better than those who came before. Her teacher, a human, put a hand on her shoulder. She told the child that crying was good. It meant she understood. It meant she felt the weight of history. But she also needed to remember that she was not responsible for what others had done. She was only responsible for her own choices. The child could choose to honor the dead by building a better future, by being kind, by standing up for justice, by never letting anyone convince her that some beings mattered less than others. The galaxy had learned its lesson. They had learned it in the cruelest way possible. But they had learned it. Humanity's mercy was real. Their forgiveness was possible. But it was earned, not given freely. And behind the mercy and forgiveness stood something else. The absolute certainty that if pushed too far, humanity would speak the only language that some understood, the language of complete and utter destruction. The galaxy hoped never to hear humanity speak that language again, and humanity hoped never to need to speak it. But both knew it was there, ready, waiting. A last resort that made all other resorts possible. That was the price of peace. And it was a price the galaxy was finally willing to pay.